Jeff, first and foremost, thank you so much for having this conversation with me.
Yeah, thank you for accepting me and our request to do this interview and everything.
Yeah, I appreciate it. I've heard your story before, and I'm really excited to get into some more of the details and also share it with our audience.
All
So
right.
my first question is, I know you're coming from a Oneness Pentecostal background, at least you have experience in that group. What were your first experiences in Oneness Pentecostalism like when you're involved as a youth?
Um, I was introduced to it at age 13. Um, my maternal grandparents were involved in the UPC almost all of their life. I guess my grandfather was converted in his 20s, long time ago in the 20th century. Um, he was probably among the first group of people licensed in that organization. And anyway, I got involved in it at age 13. There were some things going on in my immediate family that don't have time to get into here, but I my mom had given me the option at 13 to go and live with my maternal grandparents. And I didn't know a thing about what they believed, but I just knew that my grandfather, my pawpaw, as all us grandkids called him, my pawpaw was a preacher, and Granny was his wife, and I knew that they had planted churches and pastored different places, and he was in his early 70s at the time, so was she. And so they lived in Amarillo, Texas. I moved there with him in 1984, and that was the first time I was exposed to it. I remember going to a church service the first Sunday night I was there and had never seen anything like that. And there was the songs and the exuberant worship. Witness people speaking in tongues, didn't know what to make of that. When the pastor would say things emphatically, people would raise their fist and shout amen, and men jumping up and down. And when I think about the home life I had came out of, it seems so new and fascinating. And it's like, wow, I'm thinking with a 13-year-old mind, this is God. This is really neat. And I can feel God's presence here. And these songs that are just exalting and uplifting God. I mean, this is cool. I never thought about God like this, and I felt it. I felt all the rush of the emotions, and it was like, wow, this is a place where I can express myself to God like this too. I didn't know anything else at 13, and um, wanted to get involved in it. And I think that was the first place. Well, not maybe not the very first place, but I remember feeling conviction of the Holy Spirit at the end of the message and coming to the front and everything. I didn't know what I was doing. And later on, um, I was part of I was attending the Christian school that they had in the church there. And one Friday morning, it was another altar call at a chapel service. And I came to the front again, and the pastor of the church, who is also involved in the school, he's praying for me, and there's other teenage kids praying for me and everything. And my grandfather at one point whispered in my ear, and he said, Jeff, he said, if there's words that you may not understand going through your mind, he said, just go ahead and speak that out. And I that's still a vague memory because I'm 53 years old now. That was 40 years ago, but that's what I remember of it. And I didn't know any better, and I wanted so bad to be a part of what was happening. And did I speak in tongues? I don't know. They said I did. And I was so longing at 13 years old to be loved and accepted that, and whether or not I did or didn't of the spirit, I guess it happened. And I remember I was leaning backwards, kept leaning backwards, and they finally just let me lay down on the floor. And I was just like reaching out to God on the floor with my hands up. And talking to God, and I get a little bit emotional because it was a very real experience, and telling God that I love you, and just thinking, wow, I've never experienced God like this. I've heard him talked about, but this just seems really personal, really real. So that was my first experience of it. I was much too young to understand the doctrine and the theology. Um, but when the music was pumping and thumping on Sundays, and other men would start running around the church, I was excited that I could get up and run around the church with them. Um, so that was my initial exposure to it. I and of course, in every other way, I was still a 13-year-old boy and got into trouble and did things that 13-year-old boys do. But that was the initial experience of it. So I hope that answers the question.
It does. Thanks for sharing. Yeah, I remember also, even though I come from a different type of Pentecostalism, those emotional experiences as a child, and they were very sincere and very genuine on my part, and truly, from a true love for God, which it sounds like that's similar to your experience. And not understanding all the ramifications, but just a very genuine worship.
Very innocent.
Yeah, very innocent. It's a good word for it. So you've told me before that you ended up going in and out of Oneness Pentecostalism. You'd be in the church and then you would be out of the church, and I'm guessing this continued from your teens into your 20s. I'd love to hear a little bit more about that, and why would you leave and why would you go back?
Um, as the first experience happened at 13, when I was 15, 16, started to understand things a little bit clearer. Some of the innocence was gone, because you're maturing more at that age. Your thought process, your cognitive thinking, everything's maturing more. And I remember we had moved to Denver, Colorado at that time, and hearing messages about that this is the truth and this is the exclusive truth, and nobody else has got it. And I'm simplifying here, but no other denominations are saved, and they might call themselves Christian, but they're not. We're the only true church, and we're the ones that got it together. And that is, as even though you're in a different sect of Pentecostalism, or we're in, that just gets reinforced and reinforced and reinforced every time you're going to church. And how can it not if you're there 3 4 times a week? um at at 17, like I'm saying, I came from a broken home. I had never gotten to know my dad, and I wanted so bad to be a part of his life and him to be a part of mine, and we missed so much of my youth. And there came a point at 17 where, maybe there was some rebellion there, and there were some things going on again that I don't have time to get into, that weren't necessarily just and fair. But I told my family, I said, look, I'm 17 now. If you don't let me go live with my dad, the day I turn 18, I'm going to jump in my car and drive to California and go live with him anyway. And, my family didn't like that, but they gave in. My mom gave in, and let me go live with my dad. And it was coming from this position of having all these restrictions, all these church and religious restrictions, to where my dad was really on the liberal side of things. And, as long as he knew where I was, he'd just let me do everything I want. And I went nuts, experimented with drugs, and, nothing too heavy, but, was into the rebellious music and everything like that. And stayed with my dad till I was about 21. And, you know, your peers are starting to grow up. They're deciding where they want to go. They want to join the military. Do they want to go to college? Do they want to pursue a trade? And you're starting at that age, that to realize that you can't be a kid forever. And that fun, carefree lifestyle, I could see that coming to an end. And I would think, when I was all alone, it's like, man, but what about God? And those memories of this thing about this being the truth and the only way would come back. And I would think, I don't want to go to hell. I don't want to die and be lost if that's the only way. And I'd have these sobering thoughts. So one night when I was 21, I put on the best clothes I had and I told my dad, I said, I'm going to church. And my dad was really surprised. And he said, well, okay, son, what church are you going to? I said, well, I'm going to a UPC church. And he said, oh, he says, well, your grandparents will like that, and I went, and it was the same message, Natalie. And I was looking for, and you're going to hear me say this later because it was a pattern. I was looking for mercy. I was looking to be loved and just embraced. And I went there and got a performance based message. Well, you've got to do this, 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 and this. And I saw the same things in that church that I'd seen at 13, people clapping their hands, jumping around, running around. And I didn't so much feel it then, but I wanted to feel it. So I started doing what they were doing, hoping that that would somehow open the dam, open the floodgates, and I'd feel it like I did at 13. And I didn't. And it was a huge disappointment, but I didn't tell anybody and just lived with that internally. And yeah, I called my grandparents and told them, and yeah, my they were thrilled, just like my dad said. Ultimately, I wind up moving back to Denver, Colorado, and living with them in my early 20s. And I made this decision. I said, whatever it takes, whatever rules I have to follow, however hard I have to try and go at this, I'm going to do it with the hope. And again, I couldn't articulate this, but deep down there was this hope that somewhere something would change and I'd feel loved and I'd feel liberated and I'd feel renewed again. And it never happened. Um, and it was so disappointing. And I kept on that same treadmill, on that same hamster wheel of chasing it, chasing it, chasing it, and never attaining it. Um, at 21, wound up going to Bible college, and um, I don't want to get ahead of myself. There were some things that happened there where I started to see some flaws in the doctrine. And, by the time my second year in Bible college, it was just a disaster because I saw some things that were wrong, but I was afraid to proclaim that. And like I say, didn't know who to talk to. And it might have been as simple as going. They didn't have the internet back then, didn't have social media, but it might have been as simple as sitting down with my dad and saying, hey dad, can we just visit some other church and talk to their pastor, see what this is about. But I was too scared. But to answer your question, trying to find that love and acceptance and renewal that I felt at 13, and it just always seemed to elude me.
Yeah. So you already partly answered this question, but I know people would wonder if you keep leaving the UPC churches because you're not finding what you're looking for there, and there are all these restrictions and whatnot. Why didn't you ever try another church or a Baptist church or a non-denominational church? You just touched on it briefly, that fear, but do you mind to answer that a little bit more? Why didn't you go to a different church when you would come back to God?
Yeah, that's a different question. That's a good question. And the answer is kind of like you said, I touched on it. I was too scared that and convinced deep down because that was what I was raised in and it being reinforced over and over that this was the only truth. And what was the use of going somewhere else? Because, I remember one pastor when I was a young man, I don't remember the exact wording, but it was something to the effect that he's banging his fist on the pulpit saying, if you ever leave this church, you are doomed. And when you go up here and stuff like that, it impacts you because, I can have conflict with a human being all day long and walk away from that and say, well, that's just another person. But when you bring God into the picture, this omnipotent, all-knowing being. I mean, I was well aware I can't fight with God, and if this is God, my concept of God told me that was God. It was a faulty concept. But if this is what God is, then how do I go against it? So, yeah, I hope that's a good answer.
It is. So tell me more about when you were involved in the UPCI in Oneness Pentecostalism. How did you view God? Who was God to you?
God was at the worst times. I've said it, it's kind of like he was around the corner in the hallway with his big God baseball bat. And if you messed up, he was going to clobber you. And which was confusing because we mess up all the time, and it was there's this pastor and author I've talked about and on, in their comments on Burying Holiness and Friends of Burying Holiness named Jeff Harkin wrote a book called Grace Plus Nothing. And he's talking about it so much hinges and hangs on your concept of God. And if you have the idea that he's a performance-based God and the standard can be, like he says, can be a lot higher than we can imagine. And if you don't meet the standard, then you're out. And the way he says it, or at least you're not blessed, or God won't hear your prayers because you're not doing enough. And the way I look at it now is who is doing enough? Nobody is. And if we were saved by our performance, we'd make it. And one of the things he says that because of the cross, this is the important part. Because of the cross, we're unconditionally accepted. And he says either you're unconditionally accepted or God's up in heaven alone. So, you know, that's how I see it now. But that was the answer. It was performance-based acceptance. And he says he teaches it's the other way around. What I've come to embrace is acceptance-based performance. We're accepted because of the cross. And because of that, we can do what the Lord wants us to do, what Jesus wants us to do. But he guides us through that.
Right. So with that very that very performance based mentality, how did you understand salvation and the gospel? How did that affect your understanding of the good news?
I'm laughing because knowing what the gospel is now, and it really wasn't good news. I wanted it to be. I acted like it was because that's what I was told, because it was either heaven or hell, but there was no peace or joy in my relationship with God. Um, and you talked about going in and out. I mean, there was a few times in my life where that happened. And some people would say, well, well, you just loved the world. Well, not really. Just the world was the only place left to go because I'm in this world. You know, I couldn't find peace in the church. So after every time I would go back, Natalie, it was harder than before. And I try to, I don't know how else to say it. I try to play the game. I try to toe the line. I try to follow all the rules with all my heart. There was never any peace. And you hold on to the hope that someday it's all going to change and you're going to feel better and you're doing all the things they tell you to do. There was times in my life I'd pray 2-3 hours a day because I wanted that breakthrough. I'd have ministers advising me to go on 3-day fasts. I'd do that. There was times I fasted so much I messed up my digestive tract for days. I can't, now have a better understanding of fasting, but I can't fast like that anymore, especially at my age. My body just says nope. You know. So it was very hard. And I don't want to, go on and on too much, but and I guess we can get into this if you want, but in my 30s, there came a time when my dad had a severe stroke back in 2000. I wound up taking care of him, and my dad was such a kind man, and I felt like he didn't deserve what happened to him, and I think that in saying that deserve doesn't have much to do with it. My dad just didn't take care of his health at all, and the consequence that that got up to. But I took care of him the last 3.5 years of his life. Came home from work one day and found him dead when I came home. And my grandparents had passed away, my dad had passed away, and I'd lost three of the closest people in my life, plus struggling for years with all this performance basis for trying to please God. And I snapped and I'd had enough. And I consciously, at that point, around age 33 or 34, um, I said one night, sitting in my apartment, I said, I am just done with this. And I will cross any threshold that I want to cross anymore. I just don't care. I don't care about God. I don't care about church. If I want something, I'm going to get it. If it brings me pleasure, I'm going to run after it. And excuse the way I put this, but screw everything else. And I lived like that until it broke me, you know. Um, and there's people that would say, well, you put yourself in that position, and that's true too. But the thing is, what is it rooted in? And there's a root to this somewhere, and that's what I'm getting at. So, yeah, that was the long answer.
Yeah, well, tell us more about that. So this is something happened where you just eventually gave up, and you already started that part of the story. But then you're just living in darkness. Tell us a little bit more about that low point, and then how God eventually reached you and his grace reached you in that darkness.
Yeah, I'd love to. That's my favorite part of it. You know, I indulged in everything. I was working at a bar in the mid 2000s. I was one of the bouncers there. Obviously, in that lifestyle, you see all kinds of things. There was every weekend there was something going on. I mean, it wasn't it wasn't something cool like a movie. It was, it was a job, and sometimes there was ugly things that happened. Um, but dating all kinds of women and just living it up, and the consequences of that. I mean, it's in the scripture. If you sow to your flesh, you reap corruption, and you're going to reap what you sow, and the consequences may be on the delay, but they're going to come back eventually. And you can't keep living it like that without something happen, no matter who you are, what your beliefs are. Um, and it all started coming back. I went back to a UPC church one last time in 2008, and it was as worse as it's ever been. And at that point, I almost cut loose from it. I almost cut loose from it when I left. I remember the final straw on that was the pastor one night on a Wednesday night. He was teaching out of, I think it's Hebrews 6 or 10, where it says, you're familiar with this, forsake not the assembling of yourselves together, so much the more you see the day approaching. And it says at the end, for if we continue to sin after we receive the knowledge of the truth, there remains no more sacrifice for sin. And horrible exegesis on that text, because this pastor says, I have studied this. And this is a guy that's been in ministry like 30 years or something. He says, I have studied this. And he says, it's my conclusion that if you're not here every time we have church, you're jeopardizing your salvation. And I just cringed. Nellie, I made a face like you're making, and I tried to hide it because I'm sitting in the pews. And I thought to myself, I am a Bible college dropout. And I thought, I even know that's not what that verse means. And I'm thinking, what are you doing, man? And I just I felt sick to my stomach, like a knot rise up into my throat. And I was sitting at like where I'm sitting now, and across like at a 45-degree angle, the pastor's wife were there, and she must have seen the look on my face. And she looks at me and she mouths the words. She says, Brother Jeff, are you okay? And I nodded my head up and down, and I'm thinking, as soon as he gives the altar call, I'm headed out. I'm going to take the side door and I'm out. And that's what happened. And I kind of maneuvered my way through people. I never went back and got the phone calls and everything. And at that point, again, found another church that the pastor was formerly UPC, but he'd been out a long time and disentangled from the doctrine, and started to go there and felt quite a measure of peace, but I was still too scared to trust it and still too scared to talk to anyone. And I didn't go back exactly into living the life that I was. I just there were some things that I was addicted to, be addictive behaviors that I've since addressed over the last 6 years. But it got so bad that for about 9 years, I was walking in just clinical depression and was diagnosed by a psychologist and a psychiatrist of, being clinically depressed, severely depressed. And they put me on medication. Um, and the medication didn't help. It just numbed me out. And the depression got so bad, I couldn't even concentrate anymore, anything. I felt just like a stupid person because I couldn't retain any information and I was losing job after job that I would go through. Felt like an absolute loser. And there was this place I was working at. I made this mistake one day that on a metal saw in a steel fabrication place cost the company thousands of dollars. And the foreman there, I mean, when you work around welders or fabricators, these are really tough men, foul mouthed, tough men. And the foreman in this place was usually always yelling at people, that's just how those places work. I'm not saying it's right. It's just that's how they are. And when I did this, Natalie, he came up to me and he was so shocked. And he said, Jeff, he said, I don't know what to do with you. He said, and he's not yelling at this point. He's just blown away. He says, I don't know what to do with you. He says, do you know what I should do with you? He says, and I don't want to fire you, but you put me in a pickle. He says, I don't know what to do with you. And I wanted to just break down and cry right there, but I couldn't. And I left just feeling totally defeated, totally deflated. And I got home that day and I walked in the bedroom and I shut the door behind me. No one else was in the house. And I had not prayed at all, Natalie, for like 10 years. And I looked up at the ceiling like I was looking at God. And I just prayed something like, God, I said, I know I haven't talked to you in a long, long time. And I said, I don't even know what to say. But I said, I just want to come home. And I said, I don't know where home is. I said, but if you'll have me back, I just want to come back. And that's still correct. And I fell down to my knees and I cried. And these were sobs. When I tell this story, there's sobs just shaking my entire body. I couldn't do anything but cry, couldn't hardly breathe. And this took place for about half an hour. And I finally took this deep breath after about 30 minutes. And I looked up and didn't hear some audible voice, but somewhere deep down inside my spirit, something told me, you're forgiven. And I looked up like I was looking at God again, and I'm wiping tears out of my eyes. And I said, really, God? I said, you forgive me. And it was like it echoed, Natalie. And it was like the Lord was saying that to my heart, you're forgiven. And I'm just, thank you. Thank you. I'm just shouting it at this point, just telling God how much I love you because I had finally come home. And home wasn't a church, it was Him. It was my Savior, it was the Lord. And I got up and everything just looked different around me. And the next prayer I prayed was, God, I said, I don't know how else to say this, but I said, please don't make me go back to the UPC. and and I just prayed and I said, Lord, would you please send people into my life? I said, preferably Christian men that can help me untangle this mess because I'm tied in knots right now. I don't know how to untie it. And I had this person in my Facebook friends list. This was 2018 in March 2018, and his name is Jeff Garner. And I hope Jeff gets to see this. He's out of the country right now, but he pretty much saved my life. But he was part of the UPC, raised in it and everything. Comes from a prominent family in the UPC, and he had left in 2002. And somehow he was still on my Facebook friends. I never talked to him. He was one of my Bible college teachers at one time. Jeff has taught at the Urshan Graduate School of Theology, if you've heard of that. You know, he taught there as one of the professors before his exit from the UPC. Very, very knowledgeable man, PhD in theology and everything. But Jeff is just so down to earth, one of the most genuine Christians I've ever met. And I hadn't talked to him in a long time, like 15, 16 years. And I typed him a message on Facebook Messenger and I told him a summary of what I just told you. I said, all this happened to me, Jeff. And I said, I don't know what to do. And I said, I was asking God not to make me go back to the UPC. And I said, I know you left it a long time ago. And I said, can you help? And the next day, it took him all to respond. But the next day, I checked my messages, and he had left a message, and it's amazing. He had the all caps key pressed, and in all caps, he typed to me. He said, "I can help." He said, "When can you talk to me? Please talk to me." And I was fortunate to know somebody that had the experience of exiting it. And I called him, and Jeff would every Tuesday, he would sit down on a Zoom call with me and I would ask him all kinds of questions about the doctrine. You know, why did we do this? What's the deal with all the standards? Um, Scriptures I misunderstood, like Laodicea and being lukewarm and God spewing you out of his mouth and misunderstanding things like that. And Jeff explained it in a way that was biblical, but with grace. And he'd do that every Tuesday for about 2 months. And it really set my heart at ease. And like I said, Jeff saved my life. So I was fortunate that I had someone that knew where I was at that I could turn to. Not everybody's got that. So, that started the turnaround. But, to be so wrapped up in sin and in the throes of depression for 9 years, and there were people in the UPC that I didn't contact them too much, but that had written me off and thought I was dead already, like somebody that's just walking dead, and that I couldn't be reached, that I'd gone too far. And the thrill at that time in my life was that they were wrong. And I was wrong because I believed that myself, you know. But there I was, just when everything in my life was destroyed, God came and rescued me. So that's a big summary of my story, and there's a lot of details I've left out on account of time here, but you know, I, I wasn't too far gone. I wasn't too far gone, and I don't think anybody is.
That's incredible. I love your story. I love how God reached you even in the middle of that. And I love that, you did find the biblical gospel. I know too many people who have a similar story to you, but they're still lost today because they did try to go back to these hyper fundamentalist groups again and again and again. And now they're just, they're burnt out and they don't know that there's anything else to go to because these groups instilled in them that the mainstream healthy Christianity is reprobate and backslidden, and they're scared to go to a healthy church, which is just, it's mind-boggling. Yeah, so I'm so grateful that you shared your testimony of God reaching you and helping you to realize that there was more. There was something so much better than the performance-based gospel, quote unquote, that you had been offered.
And I want to bring this up just in case someone hears this, that they're at this point too. But in 2015, I sat in this upstairs room in my apartment with a shotgun loaded with double-aught buckshot. That's probably the biggest buckshot you can get for a shotgun, um, underneath my chin for 3 hours, and wanted to end it because I was so miserable. And that there would have been no coming back from that. And that would have devastated my family, all of those things. But I sat there for 3 hours, and the only thing that stopped me from doing that was, if I pull this trigger, this is it. There's no undoing this. And uh, Yahoo, I don't know if you ever used it. Yahoo used to have Yahoo Messenger, like kind of like Facebook Messenger now. And I had that open on my computer at the time. Someone sent me a message, and they weren't a Christian person. It was someone I used to date, but she sent me a message and she said something like, "Hey, what are you doing?" And I said, "Well, I'm sitting here with a loaded gun under my chin and I'm thinking of killing myself." And she just types back, she says, "What?" And she's like, "No, no, go to the hospital, go to the hospital." I said, "I don't want to go to the hospital. If I go to the hospital, they're going to call the cops." And we went back and forth a few times, and she finally talked me into going. And geez, getting yourself into the state's care after doing something like that is a whole different mess. But it stopped me from pulling the trigger. But that's how miserable I was. And one of the scriptures that has come to me, where David says, "If I make my bed in hell, you are there." He says, "If I take the wings of the morning, I dwell in the uttermost part of the sea, you're there." There's no place that you can go to that you can sink to that God isn't there. And if somebody is watching this and you think you've gone too far, and if you're on the brink of making a bad decision like that, no, you don't have to go to a church. You don't have to talk to a pastor, at least not now, but you can just run to the water. Just don't make it more complicated than it is. Just lay everything down and just call out to him and come back home. So, I realized that, now looking back years before, like you said, I wish I would have reached out to another church and not been so scared to. Maybe I wouldn't have had to go through all these years, but having had the experience, I know God's grace is so big and so deep that there's no place where he can't reach you. And this idea that you're doomed if you leave your fellowship or leave your assembly, I don't buy it. I don't. So, yeah.
Wow, that's that's impactful. Thank you for sharing that part of your story. That yeah, it got that dark, but still God kept you. It's almost like He had a plan for your life. But I know that somehow, because I know you go to church today, and this is of course years later, and I know it's not a UPC church. So tell us, what did that look like when you finally did try a church that wasn't UPC? How did that go? Tell us about that experience, as I know it was challenging, but I think it was also interesting.
Yeah. After I had talked with Jeff Garner for a couple months, I was finally ready to go somewhere. And I would have gone to where Jeff pastors, but he's in San Francisco, which is a couple hours away. And I still visit his church sometimes, but that's just quite a drive to go to church. Um, I want to say there's another man too in an ex UPC group on Facebook. If anybody is watching this, the group's called Departing, and it was founded by a former UPC pastor and evangelist named Buddy Martin, and he's in Pineville, Louisiana. But Pastor Buddy left in the 1970s, and he's counseled Pentecostals, of not just UPC, but some out of, like, came out of our fellowship that you did too. He's counseled them for years and knows all the doctrine, and he brings them into the truth of grace. but he was the second person I found in a Facebook group. But yeah, and that group is still active if anybody is watching this and wants to connect with it. But where I live at in California in the Central Valley here, there's a city called Manteca. And I was driving by this church off the highway, and it's funny, the church said Crossroads Grace, this big marquee sign. And I was just diving into the subject of grace at that time. Just couldn't get enough of it. Still can't. That's part of the Bible for me is God's grace. And I see this sign that says Crossroads Grace, and I look at the words grace, and I'm like, well, if they have it on their marquee sign, I'm thinking they must know something about it. So I walked in there one Sunday just at random, didn't know anybody, and it's quite a large church. They have three different services, and probably anywhere between 300 to 500 people, depends which service you go to. But I sat there, got us, about 5 rows deep, and the worship music comes on, and I could feel the love and presence of God as much as I ever did in a UPC church. And I talked to you about this before, and I looked up when I was experiencing this, and I literally said, I said, God, what are you doing here? And I said, you're not supposed to be here. And the tears just flowing, that, and to finally understand in a spiritual and an emotional sense that, that God wasn't confined to a denomination, that he was there and he was present. And I'm looking around and I'm like, wow, all these people have obeyed the gospel too. All these people have come to the cross like I have. And, this church is expressive enough in their worship that we lift our hands and stuff. There's no running around and jumping and crashing into walls anymore. But, there's people lifting their hands, there's tears rolling down faces and everything. And it blew my mind that God was there. And when the pastor got up to speak, the message was solid. It just went right to my heart. And I'm thinking, could it be that they were wrong? That what I was raised in, could it be that they were wrong? And the more that I've walked in it, and the more that I've walked in the true gospel and in grace and talked to other people and been discipled, there's, my friend Jeff discipled me, Pastor Buddy discipled me, other people have discipled me. Then the more I understand how big grace is and how powerful the true gospel is. And God was there, and he's in a lot of places that I was told that he wasn't. You know? Yeah,
That's awesome. Yeah, I love how that experience of finally overcoming the fear and visiting a non-UPC church, and only to realize God was there all along, that he didn't leave every other group.
it only took me 30 plus years.
Right. Right. Um so tell us just a little bit more, just recap. So you've been in this process of disentangling and studying and learning more about God and about the gospel. So how do you view God and the gospel today?
Just abundantly merciful, and more loving than I could have ever imagined. And what I've come to realize is that God is immutable. He doesn't change, right? Scripture says in him there's no variableness, no shadow of turning. Jesus Christ, the same yesterday, today, forever. One of my favorite scriptures in the whole Bible is Titus 3:5. Not by works of righteousness we have done, but according to his mercy, he saved us. We didn't have nothing to do with it. He saved us. How? By the washing of regeneration, the renewing of the Holy Spirit. I mean, God washes us and takes this old vessel that we're in and cleans it up and regenerates it and makes it new, and I think we get caught up in the sanctification sometimes too much. And I have seen with myself that some of these hyper fundamentalist groups They almost try to be made perfect by the flesh, and having begun in the spirit, we can't be made perfect by the flesh. Does God want to sanctify us? Of course, because it says the grace of God has appeared to everybody and teaching us that denying, ungodly lust, we live soberly, righteously, godly in this present world. You know the verse. But grace does that, and it originates with grace. And I'm really simplifying it here, but it's not a complicated thing. You never get away from grace. And when you start trying to make all these extra rules that aren't in the scripture, and some of it I'm convinced that God doesn't even care a lick about, you're putting burdens on yourself and on other people that don't need to be. I mean, does God want us to be modest and live right? Of course he does. But because he loves us and love transforms us into that, but not to make us righteous. Not to make it that doesn't make us righteous. Because if it does, then we tear apart justification by faith. We blow it to smithereens. So yeah, that's that's what I could say about that, I guess.
Yeah, thanks for expounding on that. For the person who might be listening to this part of our conversation and maybe they're still in Oneness Pentecostalism, or especially the ones that's all they've known, or whatever hyper fundamentalist group is all they've known, and feel like they can't measure up and they can't do enough, and that performance based mentality. So many times people will message Berean Holiness and tell us they're overwhelmed and they're afraid and they just don't know what to do. It's despair. I think despair is a good word for how a lot of people feel, just so disheartened. Is there anything else that you would add that you would want those people to hear who may be listening to this?
Sure, there's a couple things. The first is, I mean, everybody's different. For me, I needed to see evidence. And I think God knew that. And, of course, the scripture is our authority, but I needed to see evidence. And I think what I'm saying with that is, when Jesus was had risen from the dead and he goes to speak to the disciples, and Thomas says, I won't believe unless I touch his side, unless and Jesus, Jesus knew that's what he needed. He says, okay, go on and touch my side. He needed the experience. Not everybody's different. Maybe some people don't need that. But I said that to say I needed to see people that had escaped it and came out on the other side good. And that's one of the reasons I bring up my friend Jeff Garner too. That if you know Jeff and you see him today, all of the things I was taught, that if you leave us, you're doomed. If you leave us, your life is going to fall apart. God is going to throw down thunderbolts at you. None of that happened to Jeff when I started talking to him and when he started discipling me. And I saw the love of Christ in him. And when I came back to God, none of that weird stuff happened to me. And I experienced trials and frustrations and all that. That everybody does. But God has been there and I have matured as a person. I mean, I talked to you about how I couldn't even concentrate. Within a year of coming back to the Lord, God healed my mind because he addressed the things in me that were tearing me up and began to heal that. And I remember there was times, Natalie, when I noticed that, I would read something again and I'm like, wait a minute, I remember what I read, whereas that wasn't possible before. And conversations I remembered, hey, I remember what they told me now. I thought that part of my mind was gone and God restored that, So there there's no place again where you're just too much of a wreck. Um, the second thing I want to say regarding the hyper fundamentalism, one of the things that broke this open for me, and I still cling to this, I clutch this very tightly because it's precious to me, but it's in Matthew chapter 9 and in 12, and it's in Matthew's conversion. And Jesus is at Matthew's house. He's eating with other tax collectors, other the scripture says sinners. He's fellowshipping with them and eating with them. The disciples are there. The Pharisees ask the disciples, he says, "Hey, why is your master, your teacher, eating with these filthy people?" And Jesus comes back, and because he overhears this, and he says, I'm paraphrasing, that I didn't come for those that are well. I came for those that are sick. Those that are well don't need a doctor, but those who are sick. And he tells them, he says, go and learn what this means. I will have mercy and not sacrifice. And so a few chapters later in chapter 12, um, there's a part where the disciples are walking in fields of grain. Him and the disciples are traveling on foot one place to another. These guys are so hungry, they're picking up stalks of grain out of the fields and eating the grain kernels. And the Pharisees, being as nitpicky as they want to pick on that. And they tell them, they said, hey, your disciples are profaning the Sabbath. You guys are harvesting grain on the Sabbath. And when I read that to this day, it's like, really? These guys are hungry. They're eating hungry. They're eating heads of grain off the stalk. And that's the best you've got is you're harvesting grain on the Sabbath. You want to go back to legalism? Because that's what that is. That's why they're pointing it out. And Jesus probably gets annoyed. And he says to them again, he says, if you had learned what this means, if you've done what I told you, that I will have mercy and not sacrifice, you wouldn't have condemned the guiltless. And he again references things that happen in the law. And he says, don't you remember when David was on the run and he went in the temple and he ate the showbread that was only lawful for the priest to eat? He wasn't supposed to do that, but he did. And God didn't smite him. And then he tells him something even deeper. He says, and the priests themselves are in the temple doing priest stuff. And he says, and they profane the temple on the Sabbath, and they're found guiltless. I mean, you guys are so caught up in the letter of the law, you miss the spirit of it. And again, if you had understood what this means, I will have mercy and not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the guiltless. And God's heart is not about how much we sacrifice to make ourselves righteous, because that'll never work. God's heart is about mercy, not sacrifice. And if you can just come to God and let all that other stuff go and receive his mercy, that's where the heart of God is. And that's what broke that open for me. And that's one of my favorite passages in the scripture too to this day. It's all about mercy and not sacrifice when it comes to righteousness. And that I'm kind of preaching to the choir telling you this, but you know, Jesus Christ is the end of the law for righteousness to those that believe. Not the end of the law, but the end of the law for righteousness. We're righteous because God grants us his righteousness, imputes it unto us. We are right with God, and that's solid. That's not going to change. It's not going to change tomorrow. It's not going to change if I lose my temper for a second and mess up. If God's not ready to kick me out of the kingdom. And again, so merciful versus the God that I once knew. And the God that I once knew wasn't God. Yeah. So I,
Absolutely.
I hope that helps somebody that hears it. I really do.
Yeah, the mercy and the grace of God. I love to hear that emphasized. It was not too long ago we shared part of Brock Carroll's story, and somebody commented like, "Oh, that's just greasy grace and sloppy agape." But it's almost like they're being condescending towards grace and love, as if those are bad things. It's astounding, especially to anyone that's read the New Testament, where it literally says God is love. These are not. Oh, these should not be bywords in Christian circles.
Right. And God is that good. That author I brought up earlier, Jeff Harkin, he says that in an old podcast that I've listened to. And um, when I taught what was it? There's some of the first Berrien groups that you had. I was I was blessed to teach one of those, my first experience in that. But well, he says he stops at one point in this podcast and he says, "See that?" He says, "That's the thing about the grace message." He said, "It's so good you can't even believe it yourself." He says, "It takes the Holy Spirit to show you, that gradually persuades you that this is the only way it could be." He says, "And this is too good to be true, but it's because it comes from God, you know?" So, yeah, and again, you can't even believe it yourself. God has to teach you that he's this good, that he's not, like I said earlier, not around the corner with his baseball bat ready to clobber you. That's not God.
Absolutely. So my last question for you. So as you know, Berean Holiness, the way we operate, because the more resources we provide and work we do, which I feel like we've just started. We love to do so much more as far as the in-person events and bringing together community. And we love to do more groups. As you know, you participated in helping us last year or in 2022, and that was awesome. And I'm so appreciative of all the volunteers like yourself who helped us to put those on. But after doing 19 groups, we realized that there was more need than we had even capacity to serve. Even with our volunteers, we had so many people who wanted to join the groups, even groups about the gospel, about the biblical gospel. We couldn't accept them all because you can only imagine trying to teach a group with 40 people. Yeah. So we had to cap that and stop it. And we realized we need to take a big step back and create some curriculum and hire some more staff so we can offer these groups and not even just to be able to fit everyone when we do have them. But in the past, we could only have them once or twice a year, and we would love to have them year round. So many resources we love to provide, but the amount of work that goes into them, you just can't do it without full-time staff is the long term, or the long answer short. So we've decided to go the public charity route, and to try to raise the funds and find the supporters and the donors. And of course, there's a lot of people in mainstream Christianity that love supporting good causes, but when they hear of ours, they're just like, what is this? I've never heard of any kind of ministry that helps people leaving holiness churches. Why do they need help? And two things that we run into quite a bit as we try to explain this ministry is, one, why do they need faith-based resources? Like, aren't there already counselors out there and people who help people out of cults? And aren't there already these spiritual abuse resources? Yeah, they might not be Christian, but aren't they still offering these kind of services? And then the other part would be, why do they need to be donor funded? Why can't you just charge for everything? Charge, a few $100s to join the groups, or charge more for the one-on-one support, and make it more of a business, basically. So these are good questions, sincere questions. And I'd love to hear your perspective. Of course, you had this amazing experience of knowing someone who left, who was willing to talk to you every week for almost 2 months. That's incredible. But as I think you're well aware that that's also rare. So I'd love to hear your perspective on why it's important to have faith-based resources and affordable resources, why this is something worth hopefully investing in.
I guess the first thing that comes to mind to attempt to answer that is, I mentioned in the course of this interview that when I was looking for answers in the mid 90s, and that was the dawn of the internet. I mean, you didn't have social media. There was no World Wide Web to turn to with these resources back then. Now we're living in a time where it's everywhere. You have this technological explosion that's worldwide. People can find this stuff. But I think that some of the things that I was looking for early on in my reconciliation to God, there's such an overabundance of information on the internet, you don't know where to look. And, there was I summarized so much of my journey, but there was times I was looking in the wrong places for answers because when you're trying to find theological answers, there's so many churches you can find 2 dozen different answers and a whole group of people saying different things, and who do you listen to? But when it's something like this where they have a story like you and I, and the group is focused towards that, then I think somebody can find community because, hey, I found Barry and Holiness, for example. They know where I'm coming from. For me, like you said, I was blessed to find Jeff Garner. He knew where I was coming from, but like you said, that's rare. So something like this where someone can come across it, goodness, I wish there was a way to just mass market this. You probably do too. I don't know what the answer is for that, but to fund it to the point where it can reach as many people as possible and people that can connect again with community. I think any type of donation towards this would help people that are searching. Um, and hopefully if they come across it, they don't have to look as long or as hard, and because the resources are right there. But I mean, the resources don't come out of nowhere. So I hope there is someone out there that God touches their heart to deal with it, to deal with them and contribute. But it would have been a marvelous thing. I mean, I found Barry and Holiness on Facebook when you guys first started it a few years ago. It was a video of you and Nathan talking to each other. And I remember looking at that and I'm like, wow, here's somebody else that gets it. It came from what I came from. But I don't know. That might have been like a needle in a haystack. Facebook algorithm somehow bringing it up into my feed, and I know you've had so many more people discover Barry and Holiness since you began it. But yeah, I mean, to have a community out there that's got a light that's shining. If somebody can donate to that and help the light shine brighter, then yeah, then please do that. Please do that because there's hurting people out there. And this experience, I shared part of my story at one point becoming suicidal. I mean, this has traumatized a lot of people, wounded them deeply. And I got so upset yesterday on one of these pages where hearing somebody else's story, how much they'd been through in a hyper fundamentalist church and the trauma and the wounds in their spirit. And I got angry for one that it happened, but for two that I couldn't do much about it. And if there's a community that we can point them to, if I met somebody that, because I can only help so much, but if I met somebody that's really in a place of struggling, I can say, hey, here's Barry and Holiness. They have better resources than I can. They can help you. Um, I think that would be a wonderful thing. And goodness, I hope somebody out there's listening that can assist. I really hope so.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Yeah. I love your story. I'm so grateful that you shared your story, and I think it exemplifies really well just how much the distorted gospel truly harms people, and pushes them away from God and the truth. But yes, there is an antidote, and that's the true gospel. That's the biblical gospel. And I am so grateful to be able to work as part of a nonprofit that's all about getting the true gospel out to the masses. And I'm really grateful for everyone who collaborates with us to do that, whether it's financially or like you have in the past, volunteering, and even volunteering now to share your story. So thank you. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for interviewing.